Hi, everybody. This is Politics by Jake. This is the Sunday show. Welcome, welcome. Let's get started. Now, this is really kind of big. Here's a clear, up to the minute report on the Supreme Court's major ruling limiting the president's ability to unilaterally impose tariffs. And what they decided was this: the case is named Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump. And the United States Supreme Court held that the president does not have authority under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is called IEEPA. that's that's if you pronounce the acronym, that's what it is, IEEPA, an International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose broad tariffs on imports. The decision was 6-3. Wow! And it marks a rare rebuke of a central economic initiative by President Trump's second administration. This is big. Uh, Chief Justice John Roberts submitted the majority opinion and said IEEPA simply does not grant the president the power to set tariffs on import, even in a declared emergency. The law's language empowering the president to, quote, regulate importation, close quote, doesn't equate to the power to impose taxes or duties. And he reaffirms that the authority to impose tariffs and levy tariffs resides with Congress. And it always has, and we're going to talk about that a little more. This ruling vacates or upholds lower court decisions holding that the tariffs were unlawful, and it dismisses cases to the extent that they were properly before the court. 6 justices in the majority. This includes conservative appointees like Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett of the People of Praise. That's scary. Joining Roberts and the 3 liberal justices. Why this matters constitutionally and legally is this: tariff power. This is very important. Notice how our prices are going up. Notice how everything is going up. That's tariffs. It's a honk job for the American consumer. It's a honk job for the American middle class and everyone who is not, connected, so to speak. Um, and this case confirmed that, or affirmed, that tariff power is primarily a congressional authority. In the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, it gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And that historically means that Congress controls tariffs because a tariff is an impost and an excise. If the president is to impose them, that authority must be clearly delegated by Congress in statute and not inferred broadly. The court found that IEEPA doesn't clearly delegate tariff authority. The court ruled, and by the way, he's been losing all along on this. The court ruled that merely saying the president could regulate importation in emergencies is too vague to equate to the specific authority to tax imports through tariffs, especially when the tariffs in question were sweeping in scope, duration, and economic impact. And while some justices relied on ordinary statutory interpretation, which to me would be enough, others in the majority pointed to the major questions doctrine. Large economic and political decisions like tariffs require unmistakably clear congressional authorization. And, Trump was mad. He was angry, called the ruling terrible. He called them all rhinos. And then he talked about the radical leftist Democrats and, all the rube bait for the suckers and the credulous and the easily led, all the Trumpists, all the maggots. He criticized the justices, even those he appointed. He announced alternative tariffs. He doubled down, because this is what Trump does, double down, under other statutory authorities, specifically a temporary 10% global tariff under the Trade Act of 1974, Section 122, which lasts up to 150 days. This is a tactical pivot to maintain tariff policy in some form while complying with the court's ruling. And, there's major economic uncertainty because the bills collected under the now invalid tariffs, which hundreds of billions annually, could become subject to refunds. And they will become subject to refunds. The court did not directly resolve refund mechanics. I don't think this is really a big problem. It's kind of an ooh type thing. Ooh, the court did not directly resolve refund. All of this stuff is done with computers. Everybody knows what everybody owes, and I don't think that's going to be a big problem. But this decision is a significant check on executive power, not just for Trump, but for future presidents trying to use broad emergency statutes to implement large economic policies. It underscores that Congress controls tariff authority. That's it. End of story. Emergency powers cannot be used as a backdoor for broad tariff design. And if the president wants lasting tariff, he needs to go to Congress and get explicit authorization. It also sets up continued legal and political battles over U.S. trade policy heading into 2026 and beyond. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit. We're dealing with three layers here. Who has tariff? Number one, who has tariff power under the Constitution? Number two, what Congress delegated. And number three, what the court said about that delegation. So, starting with the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 says Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Tariffs are duties. So, the default rule is simple. Tariff authority belongs to Congress. Boom. The president has no inherent constitutional tariff power. Everything the executive does in trade policy must trace back to statutory delegation. Now, the statutory hook on this is IEEPA, International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That law allows the president during a declared national emergency, and honestly, you can't swing a dead cat in this country without hitting someone who's declared a national emergency. But it allows the president, in such a case, to regulate transactions, block assets, restrict trade, control import-export activity, and the key word is regulate. The legal fight over whether regulate importation, quote-unquote, includes the power to impose sweeping tariffs. That's the hinge on this. And what the Supreme Court did is what they didn't say that the president can never impose tariffs, that trade authority is unconstitutional, that emergency powers are invalid. Instead, they said IEEPA does not clearly authorize broad tariff imposition. You can't do it. That's a statutory interpretation decision. They basically said if Congress wants to delegate tariff power, because it's vested in Congress, Article 1, Section 8 that I read. So if Congress wants, so it remains vested in Congress, even in these situations. So if Congress wants to delegate tariff power in emergencies, it must say so explicitly. You can't infer it from the vague regulatory language. Now, the court leaned, at least, and this is important, by the way, the court leaned, at least in part, on what's called the major questions doctrine. And that doctrine says this: when an executive action has vast economic and political significance, Congress must clearly authorize it. No ambiguity, no inference, no stretching. Tariffs that affect the entire national economy qualify as major. So the court required crystal clear delegation, and they didn't find that it happened. Of course they didn't. And the reason why this is so big is that this is actually bigger than tariffs. It reinforces a pattern. The court is skeptical of broad executive interpretation of general statutory language. It signals emergency power does not equal a blank check. It strengthens the principle that Congress must speak clearly if it wants to give away core economic authority. And the political ramifications of this are that it creates three consequences. Number one, the president must pivot to other statutory bases like the Trade Act. Congress now owns tariff policy more visibly, and it narrows future executive flexibility. So this is important. This is a separate, for more reasons than one, because this is a separations of power recalibration. It's very important, clear boundary marker. So what it is not is that a ruling that tariffs are unconstitutional, because they're not. A ruling that the president has no trade role, a ruling about impeachment, a ruling about insurrection, a ruling about criminal liability. It's a statutory delegation case. Who has the authority to lay duties, tariffs, and imports, so on and so forth? And the structural significance, and here, this is the real takeaway. The court is increasingly hostile to executive branch expansion through creative statutory interpretation. And this pattern shows up in EPA cases, student loan cases, agency authority cases, and now tariff authority. The through line is this: if Congress didn't clearly say it, you don't get to assume it. That's the jurisprudential theme. So that is really a big deal. And I wanted to lead with this on Sunday so that we could talk about it, because this is a big deal. The president has been slapped back by the Supreme Court, and he's been slapped back in a big way, and he's really upset about it. But, what else is new? So this is Politics by Jake. Welcome to 2026. Welcome to the show. And it's going to be a big year, and we're going to be talking about that right up until the November elections and beyond. And so let's take a break at this point, and we'll have a message or two, and then we'll be right back. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Wayne Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. If you think owning things in your own name keeps you in control, think again. In today's world, lawsuits, taxes, and predators are everywhere. That's why the smart money hides in plain sight. We help you to build legal firewalls, LLCs, land trusts, private contracts that protect your assets while keeping you invisible. Call Twain Consulting today at 310-997-2204. Find us on Facebook at Twain Consulting. That's facebook.com/Twain Consulting. Protect what you've built before someone else takes it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. Okay, thank you, Twain Consulting. This is Politics by Jake, and we are back. Now, this is an attempt from yesterday's show, you might say, to militarize the entire conflict. This is where we ended yesterday's show, getting right up to this point. So let's continue on from here and do some more, because this is all crucial for my listeners to understand about what the stakes are in this election year of 2026. Now, there's a federal statute, we're now told, and again, some of these references that I put out here, I don't go through the whole citation, which says that you're not allowed to send military forces to polling places. This is, at most, the job of local police. And they, of course, traditionally don't do it in this ham-handed, intimidating type way. So there's all that. Now, of course, that means that Trump has got to keep a certain level of ICE and Customs and Border Patrol in places like Minnesota, right? Maybe he deludes himself that he could win the store, his myrmidons, right? His minions in the Republican House, that they might be able to hold on, maybe win something in the state of Minnesota. And, if you've got enough goons surrounding the polling places, maybe that could happen, in his opinion. And that's really the heart of the matter. And therefore, it's important to maintain this. You have this guy, Mark. This is the guy that puts out this Democracy Docket. The Democracy Docket people, that's a law firm, and they are fighting these things basically every week, certainly, and often every day of the week. So that has got to be supported. I urge you to do it if you can. But the question now is Trump and the militarization of the polling places. It is important. The London Independent, which is why the name claims to be a centrist newspaper, they point out now that Trump, as of the end of the year, last year, and certainly now in January and February, that Trump has, in effect, pulled his forces out of Los Angeles and Chicago. I believe those two. And that, of course, is not what he wanted. The presence of National Guard could have been used as an excuse to stay. Well, the National Guard is already there, and they're overwhelmed, so we need to send in reinforcement, and that's got to be ICE, and it's got to be Customs and Border Patrol. So in other words, National Guard. We've seen them here in Washington, D.C. You often see them in the subway. They're pleasant. They're friendly. They're often looking for ways to be useful. They want to help the city. They want to help the federal city. They want to clean up, right? Take part, bags of trash, leaves, things like that. And have done that. Did that in the autumn. But they're not, I don't think they would follow orders to attack and go in and start harassing voters. Kind of, if you remember the first Rambo movie, when Rambo's in that cave and the National Guard arrives, and when the officer says to one of the men, "You get in there now and bring him out," and the guy says, "I'm not doing it." So the "I'm not doing it" is already a refusal to obey an illegal order. And let me stress, we're going to talk about this here in a minute, but the big question on illegal orders is the most dangerous, the most toxic illegal order would, of course, be an order coming down the chain of command, if we can call it that, such as it is, to a military unit. You've got to take part in a coup, in a push. This would be the hypothetical order. In an overthrow, in other words, in this case, it might well be an auto golpe. In other words, an auto golpe is a self coup, an auto golpe. If you're legally in power, but you want to extend your reach, your powers, beyond constitutional powers, then you overthrow probably the Congress and perhaps also the Supreme Court. And then you simply rule then by decree as an unchecked, unbalanced, and he certainly qualifies on that, president. And that's what seems to be the goal. In other words, again, auto golpe, self-coup. And the most recent one was carried out by one of the more recent ones by President Fujimori of Peru, who was just famous for his auto golpe around the end of the 1990s. Okay? So that's the goal. That's what I think. And, there are a number of ways to deal with this, but let's go right to the media's race here and talk about the most effective rule, because this is something that I have tried to pioneer here. If you listen regularly to me, you have heard me talk for years now about the general strike, the mass strike process, and this is important, which culminates or can culminate, should culminate, we hope, in a general strike. Now, when I started with this, I used to think, nobody's ever heard of this. There haven't been any in the United States for 90 years or so. The last general strikes in the United States were in the Minnesota general strike. Son of a gun, Minnesota. And that was mainly a matter of truckers, right? Truckers, truck drivers, Teamsters. And that was in 1934. So, about 92 years ago. And that's where you got the Socialist Workers' Party. That was people like James Buchanan, Farrell Dobbs, and others. And this, like I said, this is heading up towards 100 years, all the way back to 1934. And, labor history is just so important, and it's not talked about, and there are reasons for that, because they don't want you to know. And they were around into the Vietnam era, those guys, and quite far into the Vietnam era, and that was one of the key labor struggles. And ironically, the same year, there was the San Francisco General Strike. And the San Francisco General Strike, also in 1934. And that was mainly a question of longshoremen. That is to say, the guys who, the stevedores, right? These are the guys who unload and load and unload cargo ships on the docks in San Francisco and related areas. Now, in the case of San Francisco, at a certain point, it spread to be an actual general strike with a strike committee. I remember this, which was no longer just the leadership of the longshoremen. And there was this guy, it was Harry Bridges, his name was Harry Bridges, who, again, he'd been around for many decades after this. But the irony was, as some of the accounts tell you, was that the leadership of the longshoremen was more radical than the strike committee. So they had something called Bloody Thursday, it was called. And a couple of strikers were killed. And at that point, it became an actual general strike of the entire San Francisco Bay Area. But you can see that this is 90 years ago. Like I said, when I started this, people don't know about this stuff. I wondered, is there anybody who has any inkling? I remember it. But is there anybody who has any inkling about these things? And I hope I have now contributed something to the fact that it is now all over the place. We want to note that on January 23rd, a general strike, or what was billed as a general strike in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as a result of all this on the 23rd, and that was, let's see, it was just, I'm just trying to find the day of the week because it was, that had something to do with it. 23rd was, a Friday? Next to last Friday in January, okay? And that was quite successful. Now listen to me, because this all lines up. Because of this capillary organization that had been obtained in Minneapolis, this kind of spontaneous, and it didn't get covered. You didn't hear about it. This kind of spontaneous self-organization is really kind of remarkable. We had heard from a number of European writers, because it's not being reported here. Maja Gessen, I guess, that said that the United States has the strongest civil society in the world. And to some extent, in this, we're seeing it. And so what is civil society, by the way? Civil society, everything above the family, everything below government. So it's everything in the middle. It's trade unions, sports clubs, it's churches, it's all these sorts of ad hoc organizations and universities, law firms, you name it. That's civil society. And at this point, let's take another break, and we'll be back. This is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine being invisible to creditors, identity thieves, and lawsuits, protected and secure no matter what. Virtual invisibility uses proven business and legal strategy to shield your assets and your privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind, and that includes you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control today. Call 213-465-0639 or go to Facebook, facebook.com/Twain Consulting, and make yourself truly untouchable. Now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake, and we're back. And so we were talking about civil society and what that is. Trade unions, sports clubs, churches, all sorts of ad hoc organizations, colleges, universities, law firms, you name it. That's it. And it has turned out to be quite strong, and it is quite strong. And in particular, given the way a general strike works, that's what we're talking about. For those of you who joined the show, welcome to the show. We're talking about the general strike right at the moment. Given the way general strike works, and there was one in Minnesota, and I'll bet you didn't know about it, did you? The European papers and the British papers are the ones who have to be reporting this. You're not hearing about it because the American media has been compromised, and you could argue that it's collapsed. It's collapsed like a rotten building. But given the way the general strike works, the participation of labor, trade unions, workers, organized workers, this is the decisive ingredient. And I'm not sure exactly how much organized labor participation there was in the January 23rd general strike in Minneapolis. Some people, might argue, well, there are no more factories, and I'm one of the ones who would be saying that. So, in other words, if there are no more factories, you can forget about the workers. No, 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 no. You're going to need workers. You're going to need Teamsters. You're going to need the UAW. You're going to need United Steelworkers. You're going to need the teachers' unions. So this is not industrial, but it's relevant enough. So on January 23rd, it was thought that they had about 50,000 people in their demonstration, and I'm sure that's an underestimate of what was really going on. But this is the important thing, and this is why we're talking about this. Because when I say that 2026 is going to be a momentous year, these are the tools to fight back against the illegitimate Trump regime. The word is out. In other words, the spirit of mass strike, which is cool, the spirit of the mass strike, and indeed of the general strike, is now abroad in the land. And this is critical because this is the most essential task that we have on the domestic front, is to recognize that if Trump decides to steal the election, the most effective form of opposition is a general strike. Now, let's just, a mass strike is what we've been in last spring or early last summer. Say if you want to go and you want to look at the hands-off demonstration of the 5051 group, that you could maybe count the mass strike era period of current history from then, or maybe you want to wait until June, a little bit later, a couple of months later, and that was the first of the No Kings demonstrations, right? And certainly by the time you got to October and the 8 million at the demonstrations then, you're in a mass strike, period. But that's kind of general terrain. What has to happen then in order, because it's mass strike and then it's general strike, right? What has to happen then in order to get the maximum political effect is to crystallize that mass strike into a general strike. And now, I think that is on the agenda. And at least I think that's the relevant task for all of you, my listeners. One of the great things about KCAA is that it appeals to the working man. And I know there are great shows on by people who talk about things that are important to the working man. And I applaud that and I support that. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about it. Because as I said, I think now that this is definitely on the agenda. And it's the perfect station, the perfect forum in order to talk about that, maybe of any forum in California. So KCAA, let's hear it. That is the relevant task. So it's a mass strike era, and what has to happen is that it's got to be concentrated and organized into a general strike. Now, the tradition, didn't I tell you 2026 was a momentous year? These are the things. Don't be a looky-loo. Don't be a tire kicker. This is your country. This is power, and you can do this. So now the traditional view of this, okay, is when there were pro-labor political parties, and when there were all sorts of trade unions, right? You know, as we've been saying, the idea is the ferment of a mass strike is spontaneous. It can be a wildcat strike. It can be something which is done like Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a very good example. It's an answer. It's a response to an unacceptable, excruciating, God knows Minnesota has been through it, and it's been unacceptable, excruciating, and a horrendous situation that makes people come together to overcome the usual modes of society and say, let's set up these various activities so that we can protect our neighbors, protect our cities, and try to limit the harm that can be done by these ICE Gestapo stormtrooper goons, these squadristi, these brown shirts. And that, of course, is tremendously important. But there's got to be another element that it is very unlikely that 1 in 10 million in this country at the present time knows the history of the general strike. And we've got to tell you, because this is power. This is our power. And one of the main things that emerged from this, I'll be talking about now for quite a while today and in the coming weeks. The thing is, you've got the spontaneous mass ferment, but it needs guidance. It needs education, and it needs leadership. So the big moment is, do you have a group of people? And listen to me now, because this is political action that I'm talking to you about. And we're going to talk about a little bit about how, we're going to talk a lot more about it, but we're talking about how to do it. So do you have a group of people? It can be limited in number. Do you have a group of people who want to intervene, who want to go out and start propaganda, and then who want to go from propaganda, which is talking about what you want to do, to agitation, which is actually doing it, right? Leading people, say, out on strike. And the idea is this has to be inclusive as it can be. And the agency involved in a general strike has to be a united front. It often takes the form of a strike committee, and the significant forces, be they numerical or be they programmatic, intellectual, because there's got to be room for that. That becomes, you have to have technicians, you have to have operators who understand these things. That becomes a key part of the leadership. So you've got to essentially face the fact that the average person does not know what to do exactly in these situations. And if you lead them to their own devices, they may well fall back into the old ways, and the old ways have failed. And the old ways are essentially the identity groups. The identity groups have really bound hand and foot the Democratic Party, because you've got the identity groups, you've got the color groups, and they all have money, they're all paying money, they all want, the only thing they want is their message. And they're all really at odds with each other. The Democratic Party is trying to fight these battles and get into power with all these identity groups to say, if you don't do my message and give it priority, I'm not going to give you any money. The identity group politics, in particular, of the Democratic Party after about 1970 are the results of defeat. And they've been institutionalized, and that is not good. And people have a very hard time breaking away. And in particular, the bad old days are characterized by a desire to make every economic question into a racial question. It's got to be race. It's got to be loaded from that point of view. And of course, that contradicts what it is that you really need. Look, you're going up against a powerful adversary. You need unity. And what you can't have is a constant sniping from one group to another and then back again, because this is going to undermine what you're trying to do. It's going to weaken your strike movement. So you've got to make up your mind that the united front that's engaging in this general strike is what you've got to build. And you've got to leave aside all the baggage of decades and decades, right? You've got to stop it. That's what I'm telling you. You've got to stop this nonsense. Mass traction economic demands. The proverbial tide that raises all boats. 90 years since the last general strikes that I know of anyway. And at this point, let's take another break with Politics by Jake, and we will be back. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. If you think owning things in your own name keeps you in control, think again. In today's world, lawsuits, taxes, and predators are everywhere. That's why the smart money hides in plain sight. We help you to build legal firewalls, LLCs, land trusts, private contracts that protect your assets while keeping you invisible. Call Twain Consulting today at 310-997-2204. Find us on Facebook at Twain Consulting. That's facebook.com/Twain Consulting. Protect what you've built before someone else takes it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. So, all right, this is Politics by Jake, and we are back. And we're talking about general strikes, and we're talking about some of the mechanics of it. And we're talking about the things that have prevented the Democratic Party from keeping power, and which to a great extent is the identity groups, who are every group, all for themselves, nobody for the whole. And it's bad. I mean, look, you need everybody. You can't just reduce this to race. You can't go for regional stuff. You can't do gender, okay? There's so many things. And there are a lot of identity groups. There's so many things that we just don't have time for because they divide us. And what's the old Roman adage? Divide et impera. Divide and conquer. And that's not surprising because they were invented. These things were invented, they were thought up and imposed and propagandized in order to divide. And the idea, for example, of plain white construction workers against black unemployed goes back to George Shultz. Remember him? Secretary of Labor in the Nixon regime about 1970, and also in the Bush regime. And this was called the Philadelphia Plan. And with this, they were able to split the working class, in effect, and other things around the same time. You may remember the Ocean Hill. Then again, you may not. But take a lesson, sit at the radio, or however you're listening to this, and listen to this because this is important stuff. You may remember, maybe not, but there was Ocean Hill. There was Brownsville Community Control of Schools. These things come out of the efforts of, well, it's what kind of radicalism there was. There was this sort of local control. There was this community control and so forth. And this is a way to fragment working people. So that stuff, you've got to put that stuff aside. And again, think of a strike. And the big imperative of strike is to spread it. And above all, if it's a trade union that you're starting with, the trade union does not automatically think that they need to help organize the unemployed. But I'm telling you something, they do. Because if you don't include the unemployed in your organization, in your united front, then they will be used as scams against you. They will become strike breakers. So you've got to get ahead of that dynamic and make sure that you're making demands that are broader than just wage demands at your factory. It includes those, absolutely, but it's got to go beyond that. Things like demand for minimum wage, public housing, or things like that. Because remember, this is the ultimate weapon. The ultimate weapon against tyranny has been seen now for maybe 130 years or so. I think some of the earliest examples of this are the mass strikes in Russia, and in particular in Poland, which at that time was part of Russia, which was crushed by Russian imperialism, and in particular Warsaw and the other great cities of Poland. These were the theaters in which this stuff played itself out. So again, this is what you've got to bear in mind, that the spontaneous ways of thinking are, I think the proper term is parochial. And when I say that, I mean narrow, exclusive. It's got to be our union and our union only. See, this is the identity group concept. This is the color group concept. This is the ethnic group, the racial group, the sports group. You see what I mean? If you do that, you're defeated. Because then you've got the strike breakers, and you haven't done anything to compel politicians to take your movement seriously, and so on. So you have to have a process of education. For example, in the United States today, given, this regime that we have, you've got to have some foreign policy planks. You've got to have support for Ukraine. You've got to have support for NATO. You've got to have support for Japan and Korea and Taiwan, because you're defending a country which is a keystone of an alliance system which has kept the peace. This is how the United States has lived. And to dismantle these alliances is crazy. In terms of this local stuff, the name you need to remember, and then once you remember it, you need to avoid it, is Saul Alinsky. Alinsky was essentially a deployment against Roosevelt, against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and against the Democratic Party, because what Alinsky said is, we can't be political. It's all got to be very local. And it's got to be a bunch of people who get into some struggle around a purely local issue. And of course, the result of this is very often failure. And I mean, I think when you think about it for a minute, you can see why that would be. So the idea is if Saul Alinsky got a struggle going in some place, then the people, well, if you went back in 5 years, you'd basically find no organization left, no structure left, basically nothing left. Because some of them got so demoralized and tired, they decided to quit and to drop out. And they decided, to go to the ball game or, to the beach or, wherever it was, because they were getting nowhere. Or if it wasn't that, they had some modest success, moved to the suburbs, so forth. So in terms of successes, the Saul Alinsky model basically has none. And again, it's a particularist, parochial, localist, practically an identity group. In other words, it's a neighborhood identity group that he was always pushing. And the idea is what you needed. It was the opposite of the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. When they say AFL-CIO, AFL is the American Federation of Labor, and the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organization. They used to be separate. But they joined, and that's the craft unions. That's the bricklayers, the boilermakers, the pipe fitters, the carpenters, and the other skilled workers. And that is the aristocracy of labor, if you want. Some of them anyway. So that's one side, the AFL. But then there was also the CIO. And you may remember we had every New Year's Eve in New York City in the 50s, some of you older folks. Into the 60s, there was Michael Quill. I definitely remember Michael Quill of the Transport Workers Union out there for a 40-hour week. And that's an industrial union. And that's the idea of the CIO, with the Congress of Industrial Organizations. In other words, the goal was to become the CIO board. Would be basically the representatives of the UAW, United Auto Workers, and the Teamsters, and the steel workers, and the chemical workers, and so on. And that would be then class-wide, at least as a tendency, as a possibility. So you've got to think about class. And that's the other thing. You cannot delude yourself that rich people are going to be as concerned about your situation as they are concerned about their own loot. They're not. And of course, in today's world, this is what I talk about all the time. The people who are their own poverty because they think that somehow Donald Trump shares their interests. He doesn't. None of those oligarchical people do. They don't. It's the furthest thing from their mind. That's why they call you suckers. That's why they laugh at you. That's why they feed you little things called rube bait to make you think that they think the same way that you do. They don't. In today's world, class lines have become, if anything, more pronounced. If you're an oligarch, you know it. And most people are not. If you're not Elon Musk or Sachs or in the White House or Bezos or Zuckerberg or these people, it's essentially the tech bros. Silicon Valley, with AI and some other stuff. And at this point, let's take another break, and we'll be back with Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine being invisible to creditors, identity thieves, and lawsuits, protected and secure no matter what. Virtual invisibility uses proven business and legal strategy to shield your assets and your privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind, and that includes you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control today. Call 213-465-0639 or go to Facebook, facebook.com/Twain Consulting, and make yourself truly untouchable. Now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. All right, this is Politics by Jake, and we're back. So, like I said, if you're an oligarch, you know it. Most people are not. If you're not Elon Musk or Sachs or, the AI czar in the White House, that guy, or Bezos or Zuckerberg or these people, it's essentially the tech bros. Silicon Valley with AI and some other stuff. And that's the leading edge of a pretty rapacious oligarchy. So you've got to realize, you really have to realize, these people are not your friends. You MAGAists, you Trumpists, oh, you credulous, who can be so easily led into thinking that the rich have the same interests that you do. They're not going to be your friends. They don't have the same interests that you do. They're not your friends. So there we go. It's just, all right. So these are some considerations. Now, a couple of other things to know about a general strike. It proceeds through ebbs and flows. Flow and ebb, flux and reflux. No, this isn't an antacid commercial. This is Politics by Jake. And we're talking about the mechanics and the specifics of the general strike, because you may need to know it, because we're coming up on a very serious situation in November 2026 with a person who says that he'll surround, that's Steve Bannon I'm referring to, ICE will surround. He says ICE will most certainly surround the polling places because Donald Trump thinks, the 2020 election was stolen. And it wasn't. This is an old saw. He's still trying to get people to believe it. And Bannon, for his own purposes, because he, like many other people in the cabal, is just trying to jolly Trump along because it helps him to get where he personally wants to be. And Bannon is dangerous. Bannon is more dangerous than Trump. Stephen Miller is more dangerous than Trump. Many of these guys, they're dangerous people. Trump, comparatively, not so much. So, all right. In other words, getting back to this, the mass strike period, and in particular the opening of general strike, is not a permanent situation. And there's a lot to be said about this. It is generally very difficult or impossible to call a general strike. The mechanisms, the dynamics of a general strike are not susceptible to bureaucratic control. It's been seen again and again, and people have written about it. I've seen it myself. You can have a population which is subject to real oppression, grinding poverty, humiliating laws, just being driven down into the mud, and they don't respond. And then out of nowhere, what seems to be, to the outside observer, seems to be a small incident. That small incident unleashes a general strike like wildfire. And I'm thinking the one that this reminds me of basically is done somewhat artificially, but in Tunisia, and a lot of you may remember this, in 2011, the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring. And Arab Spring was a CIA op. Let's just get that out of the way. It was a CIA operation. We don't need to have any illusions about that. That's what it was. But there was this fruit vendor named Boazidi who was killed by, it looked like, the police. And then, with appropriate media support, this blew the lid off of Tunisia. And that rapidly then spread around the Arab world with the help of these pre-existing networks. So if you don't want the spook networks, that's the CIA. If you don't want the spook networks to control everything, you better have your own network there to do it. But the idea is that it's unpredictable. It follows its own internal logic. Like I said, it's like wildfire. You almost don't know what's going to set it off. This may not be obvious to outside people, and I get it. I get it. In other words, you're in the realm of a mass strike psychology, mass strike reactions. But the thing you want to do is to always make sure that there's programmatic and educational force that intervenes and tries to raise the level of class consciousness. In other words, remember, class is not Marx. The oligarchy, the money power wants you to think that this is all communist, that class struggle, the bourgeoisie, the worker, it's all Marx. It's not. It's not. It goes back to Plato in the Republic. And he says an oligarchy is a constitution filled with many evils, where the rich run everything and the poor people have no say whatsoever. That's Plato, 400 BC or something like that. That's the Republic at Book 8, I think. So in other words, you've always had that. You see, that's what you've always had, and people have to be again. They have to be aware of this, that there is this class division, and no matter what people say, you've got to be extremely diffident and careful for people who have a lot of money and backing and media support about how they're going to treat you. You cannot let the media choose your leaders, because if the media chooses your leaders, you will get the worst ultra lefts, because that's what they want. It's spectacular, it's big talk, it's big confrontation, and then it's defeat. Because that doesn't play, like the old saying is, that won't play in Peoria. That's not going to work in the flyover zone. And that is what the mass, the controlled corporate media, want to get out of these things. So, there are difficulties along the way. And once again, you can't be all verklempt, and ashamed of yourself that you're not a worker. And you, as a middle class person, presuming to tell the member of some identity group, or a worker or another identity group what they ought to do, you've got to prepare yourself to be right and then bring home the lesson, because if you don't, somebody else will. The leadership is always a big question. So the ultimate weapon against tyranny, sometimes it starts off with economic demands. Sometimes it's going to be a demand for minimum wage. Sometimes it's going to be a demand for health care. Sometimes it's going to be some other demand, build public housing. You want to make sure that these economic demands are mass traction economic demands. You remember? You heard me say this earlier in the show. Not special privileges for one group as opposed to another. That's poison. It's got to be all across the broad front, because everybody is needed. And in the last analysis, everybody is somehow the victim of the current system. Apart from that tiny, what is it, 1/10 of 1% who are at the top. In other words, the billionaires. No, 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 they're not the victims, but just about everybody else is. So it's the ultimate weapon against tyranny, the general strike. It was tried out on January 23rd in Minneapolis. And that's the first time since 1934 that I know of that general strikes have emerged. And that's what you're going to have to be ready for. All right, so you've got to pose this and say, if you take away to Trump and the oligarchs and the money power and the fascist cabal, if you take away our democratic stability, we will take away the economic stability. So that's pretty good language right there. Pretty good analysis. Write that down. Remember, of course, that Trump, and when he was talking with Bongino, remember Bongino, failed deputy director of the FBI? He was incompetent. They flanked him with some kind of alter ego who would be a co-deputy director. So Trump said, "You're damn right. What Bannon said is right. We're going to have ICE surround the polls come November." And there's only one answer to that, and that's a general strike. That's just game over at that point. And another one here, Bannon. I said, Bannon, as I said earlier in the show, who came out and said, and I'm repeating this because it's really important that you hear what their intentions are. Their stated intentions that they have actually said. It was Bannon who came out and said we're going to have ICE around the polls because we're not going to have the Democrats steal the country again. Bannon, of course, smarting from the fact, I might add, that he's mentioned so often in the Epstein files. Carolyn Levitt, or Leave It or Levitt, Love It or Leave It. I can't guarantee, she said this, I can't guarantee that an ICE agent, an ICE Gestapo, I shouldn't say Gestapo, I said Gestapo, that an ICE Gestapo agent won't be around a polling station in November. But what I can tell you is that I haven't heard the president discuss any formal plans to put ICE outside a polling station. Well, maybe that means he wants them inside the polling locations. So a couple of more things. Uh, we need to show that this is not acceptable. You cannot. What happened in Minnesota is not acceptable. You cannot go to the levels that we've used to invade other countries for, Saddam Hussein and so forth, basically for doing such autocratic garbage like they can't. It's not going to stand. The American public won't stand for it. You who are listening to the sound of my voice, which is everywhere in the country, won't stand for it. Can't stand for it. In Minnesota, they won't even stand right now for the fact that you have ICE agents roaming around in our neighborhoods without warrant. Imagine what's going on. What's going to happen to the American public when you have a bunch of ICE agents trying to go to different ballot boxes, trying to stop the count? The reaction is going to be very strong. Now, again, an example of the scale and intensity of what we're going to need here is going to be nationwide. Uh, I've talked about this too, but I'll talk about this and we'll end the show on this. This is the Kapp Putsch in Germany in, I guess it's March of 1920. So the idea here is that World War I is over, okay? Tremendous suffering, British sea blockade that has been keeping food out until essentially late 1919. To force them to sign the terms of the Versailles Treaty, force Germany. And we have the top civil servant, a guy like, the senior executive service, like some of these civil service guys in the White House, right? Something like this, senior executive service. And that's Kapp. And then there's the other guy, and that's Ludwitz. And he's one of the top commanders of the German army. At this point, that's called the Reichswehr. And they have the young Hitler, who's actually taking part in this. Now, young Hitler's not one of the leaders. He flies up with Ritter von Epp, I guess, at the control. He flies from Munich to Berlin a day or two into the strike, and the young Hitler wants to take part. So I think in order to understand the achievement of this, we ought to call it the Kapp-Ludwitz-Hitler Putsch. That's what was being attempted. They were trying to destroy the Weimar Republic. So what happened is that the Social Democratic government fled from Berlin. But as they were fleeing, they got together with the leaders of the trade unions, the GGB, the German, that's the equivalent of the AFL-CIO, and they put this together. And they called for a general strike on the political basis. In other words, a general strike designed to defeat the Kapp-Ludwitz-Hitler Putsch. And a putsch is a coup. They were trying to destroy the government. They were trying to bring down the newly created Weimar Republic. It was just a few months old. The German word is Putsch, especially if it involves high military officers. Again, that's where we know the worst kind of illegal order is an illegal order to subvert the Constitution. Overthrow the legal government and have a self-coup, an auto-golpe, to take a bad but legal government like we have now and turn it into a worse and illegal government. So what happened? Well, the strike was a success. And it meant that, as we've reviewed in the past, the entire railroad system was shut down. The entire telephone system was shut down. The entire electrical system was shut down. The water system was shut down. There's a movie about this where the coup plotters have taken over one of the government ministries, one of the executive department. They're there. They're trying to make phone calls. They have to send out couriers on motorcycles or even bike because the toilets don't work because there's no water. So they get into trouble. And of course, at night, they've got to pull out candles because there's no electricity. And then even as the government, the social democratic government, is fleeing, they reach a point where the workers say, sorry, you have to get off because this is where the strike begins. Imagine they're on the trains. They're getting out of Berlin. And the workers, the conductors on the trains tell them they have to get off because the strike has just started. And they say, we're not going any further. So think about what that would mean today. If no pilots show up, there will be no air traffic. If there are no engineers, there are going to be no trains. That includes freight trains. If the Teamsters walk off the job, there won't be any truck traffic. And all kinds of government functions can also grind to a halt. At least it would look that way from the outside. So this is what would come under the heading of a general strike, okay? And this is quite dramatic. But we're out of time. We'll be talking about this more. I invite you to come back to the show. Welcome for being here. Welcome to listening to me. Let's be in the fight with us together. And we'll see you the next time. And this is Politics by Jake.